Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy. Welcome to this episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. And my name is David Wheatley, and we're having another conversation with Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod, who are two long-term leadership development, executive development consultants who I've worked with Judy for the best part of 20 years, and she has conversations on a regular basis with Rick, and we record those. And this one is about the conversations we can't have and the power of having them. And it's really talking about what happens when you get to the success or the failure and you experience the opposite side of that. And sometimes when we achieve what we always wanted to achieve, there's a lull and there's a lack of structure, meaning, and identity that means that we experience a dark side of it. But Judy and Rick and I are going to talk more about it. We'll catch you after this chat. Enjoy. Well, welcome to another episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. And as we've got a bit of a theme going in the last few months, I'm joined again by my esteemed colleagues and guests, Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod. And the way we've framed these up is to have a conversation. So these are slightly longer than my normal episodes, but they should be conversational. And I don't know about anybody else listening, but I've been finding snippets that I've been using all the time from these conversations. And so we said we'd start with a question and then just see where it went and then call it a day after about 40 minutes. And our question this month is more of a statement. We're talking about the conversations that we can't have and the power of having them, which I love the paradoxical nature of our introduction. So Judy, start us off on the conversations we can't have and the power of having them.
Thank you, David. Actually, as Rick and I have talked over these many months, one of the things that got kicked off in the conversation was about what happens when people get what they want and end up getting a lot else with that they didn't want, essentially. It would be my framing of it. Rick would be more elegant about that. But that was actually an exploration that was kicked off by an ad that was run in the Wall Street Journal, which I'm going to ask Rick to read to us, was run by a CEO. So Rick, tell us what he said in the ad.
Right. This appeared in the LA area Wall Street Journal. And this was some years ago now. And it said, "Sold my business. I thought I'd prepared myself for the changes that come with lots of cash and the loss of position. But I'm still uncertain and depressed. I can't exactly find a new rhythm to my daily life. I'm forming a group of retired, quote unquote, retired execs. If you're in a similar position and interested, reply to." Judy, I'm going to read this again and invite our listeners, as I read it this time, to pay attention to your reaction to this ad. Not in a judgmental way, not in a critical way, in a very curious way. "Sold my business. I thought I had prepared myself for the changes that come with lots of cash and the loss of position. But I'm still uncertain and depressed. I can't exactly find a new rhythm to my daily life. I'm forming a group of quote unquote retired execs. If you're in a similar position and interested, reply to box, whatever it is, Wall Street Journal."
Right. And I, for one, when I heard this, thought, this does not describe my life. That is a problem that I have not had so far. I don't anticipate having, selling a business, sitting on a huge pile of cash and really feeling lost at sea as a result of that experience. And so I realized, as we were chatting away about this, Rick told me he got a call out of the blue from this guy who ran this ad. And I wonder, Rick, if you'll tell us a little bit about what that experience was like and your reaction to it, which probably wasn't as kind as it might have been. So what happened? This guy calls you after he runs this ad. What's the deal?
Right. Well, actually, Judy, the timing was a little bit, he called me and essentially said the ad to me, told me about how he was struggling. And now I will tell you, and why I invited, the other folks to pay attention to their reaction, because I can tell you mine, and it wasn't terribly kind or sympathetic, which turned out to be some of the most critical data I ran across in looking at this issue of the unexpected, unanticipated consequence of achieving significant goals. Significant defined by him in terms of selling this liquidity event, but really significant being defined by most of us in terms of it mattered to me. So here was my first reaction as he told me this. Really? If I had your problem, I'd have no problem. If I was the recipient of that largesse, I'd be much more worthy of it than you are. And then the one that hit me later on, that he was, forgive the language, he was pissing me off. It took me a while to understand what that anger was about. And the language I came up with that is he was dissing my myth. That here I was bartering my life for some piece of a pie, believing that what would life would be like when I got my piece of the pie, literally bartering my life on a day-to-day basis for that. And here was a guy that got a Costco-sized pie, and this was the result. It was deeply unsettling because it questioned some fundamental assumptions that were a part of my life and his. And what happened is we talked, and as we have said, we are discovering that conversation is a fertile ground for emergence. And he had this natural inclination to reach out. At first he wanted, he didn't quite know what to do. And then bravely, he put this ad in the Wall Street Journal.
Which starts us off on that idea of the conversations that we can't have and the power of having them, because what you're identifying there is somebody who's achieved all the goals that many people are looking for and yet didn't know what to do then, and was bold enough to put that out there and be willing to have the conversation. That even though I've got all these resources, I'm still lost and depressed, and I'm looking for some connection and some routine and something that, and the rest of us all turn around and say, what are you complaining about? You've got all these resources, you shouldn't have that. And that's this idea of putting out there the conversation that may actually help, but is somewhat taboo normally, that stop complaining about your success.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry, Judy, we're going to talk over it. We've agreed we'll talk over each other periodically.
You're on.
I think that, what I've come to understand, David, just to build on what you said, is not only did he have this experience, which was shocking, deeply unsettling, but the nature of what you just said added isolation and the kind of my reaction, which it took me quite a while to identify, was an indication of his sense and our sense of what's okay to talk about and what's not. And so he didn't have a chance and didn't know, amongst all of these experiences, that this was normal, natural, predictable, and that because we don't talk about it, we don't know about it. And we have this myth of what happens when we get something really important. And on top of that, it's a sense of I failed at success.
Right. This should not be happening to me. It's the, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And furthermore, when I even have the courage to poke my nose out and say, I'm really at sea and I'm miserable, there is a sense of the dismissiveness with which the rest of the world responds to that. And so we've been courageous and we've been poked in the eye about it. I mean, I think my language, which is just deeply unsettling and leaving a person feeling hugely disconnected. And he's already disconnected from his prior life, because the day he got the money, his prior life went away. All the things that he valued in that evaporated with the gain of what he thought he had wanted. And the disorientation that comes from that is huge. There's another when I first talked with Rick about this, the story really sort of hit me in the gut. You know how stories hit you in the gut, and I thought there's something about this that is really powerful for me. And then I thought, Judith Ann, that is ridiculous. You aren't going to sell a business. This man's story is not your story. And then I remembered a parallel for me that had happened, and in northern Michigan, as it would happen, which is where I come, Michigan being David Wheatley's place now. And it was not being able to talk about the truth of an experience that was loss. So Wes's story is about having had a huge gain and experiencing loss from it and not being able to have a conversation that had really real heart and in which he was seen. So mine was that after having married late in life to a fabulous Brit by the name of David, I would add, since there are multiples of these.
But not this one.
Not that one, no, not that one, another one. David, my husband, died suddenly. And I was suddenly in a completely, I guess what I'd say is, I kind of like an open life that wasn't what I had in mind, much like Wes was with the change. All of a sudden, he had been in a life that was, was fine. And all of a sudden he found himself in a different place, and so did I. And everyone was huge. In this case, it's the opposite reaction. Everyone is hugely sympathetic as appropriate to the situation. Although the challenge was that some days I was having quite a wonderful life. And that was very hard to talk about. And the ultimate was when I went, I think I got poison ivy or something on my hand. I had to go to Munson Hospital to have them take a look at it. So I went into Traverse City to Munson Hospital, and they sat me down as they do, and you have to fill out all kinds of information about yourself. So the woman is asking me all kinds of questions, and she's writing things down, and she says, marital status. And I said, my husband died about 5 or 6 months ago, so I'm single. And she says to me, no, you're not, you're a widow. And I said, no, I'm single. And she says to me, not yet, you're not. You're a widow. And I found myself in this conversation, if you could call what was going on a conversation, with the healthcare system's insistence that it would not have a conversation with me about the true nature of my life at that point. It was the wildest experience. So sometimes it's that there's a loss, but it hides incredible gifts and riches. My daughter said at one point, after David died and something happened that was quite joyful, she said, this is the upside of the downside. And what we're talking about here in some ways is the dancing between the upsides and the downsides, and the unwillingness of the world around us to see who we are really in this moment, and to see the full emotional waves and dynamics of that, and to allow a space for it. That's when I began to see what Rick had gotten us into with this conversation with the CEO who was depressed and lost his rhythm.
Well, it's
So,
interesting because when we first were talking about this as a subject, I went downstairs and told Londa that we were thinking of it as a subject. And she said, oh, yeah, that's like me and my friend. We talk about how sometimes we really don't like our kids. And that's not a conversation you can normally have. But it's that fact of right now, I might not like them. Now, do we still love them? Absolutely. But that's that dark side, light side thing again, is that some of these conversations that you don't feel like you can have, whether it's I'm enjoying life after death, or whether I'm depressed after selling my great business, or whether I'm talking about not liking my kids at the moment, that there's a need to have that and a value in having that conversation.
It's interesting, David. I really love that you brought that up, because when we start these, this kind of conversation, or whenever
my kids don't listen to this, by the way, so I'm in good shape.
Oh, you're good. You're good. God forbid that, and of course, you can't talk about, thank God my kids are gone and we have an empty nest. You can't do that. You can say, oh man, the kids are gone, we have an empty nest, it's so hard, and everybody be sympathetic, and as soon as you say, oh, the kids are gone, it's so fabulous, people are going to be critical, or what's the matter with you, or didn't you love your kids? So I think one of the themes that Judy and I discovered with each other through this kind of again, conversation is the fertile ground for emergence. In this sense, the emergence was awareness, the awareness of a more whole picture, a more normal picture, a more natural picture of loss and gain as coming together. And often one brings the other.
Yep.
And that somehow or another, we are invited to look at only one side of that picture. We are prohibited in some way from examining the other. And so it took years, literally, for me to start seeing the dynamic that Wes had offered us, this canary in the mine, to see it in so many other places. Olympic athletes that were really having trouble after the Olympics. I won the gold and lost my gold. Mm-hmm. My daughter graduating from college. It goes on and on. Anne Hathaway standing in front of, saying about her Oscar, I tried hard to pretend to be happy. Like, why would you have to pretend to be happy? What is it that forms and shapes that? And there's a phenomenon, I think, that I've identified that accounts for that, and it's called a focusing illusion. A focusing illusion in its simplest terms is, and they lived happily ever after. And when you read the kid, if you read your kid the story and they lived happily ever, no kid ever says, really, doing what? And I was kidding you, David, as we introduced this, like, okay, you're trying to help people get there. What do you got for them when they do?
Yep. Yeah, and so I think that's the question we're exploring is when we do hit our goal, is there a downside to that? And another multitude of other conversations that as leaders, we need to be aware of and ready to have. Because as Londa said, the ability to talk with somebody else and say, sometimes I don't like my kids, and for them to say, sometimes I don't like mine either. All of a sudden, that's we can talk about it. We can actually feel free to talk, and the level of engagement between those two is dramatically higher because they can say those things, and nobody's judging. They're just saying, that this is okay. We all go through these kinds of things, and that's perfectly okay to be there. But I guess there's a couple of questions. A, what stops us from having that conversation other than societal norms? And then B, how do we start to have them with people as leaders in whichever community we're in?
Judy, there's a couple of things you said that I think are really important. It took a while to realize that he was a canary in the mine, that the dynamics he was experiencing, as I said, could be found over and over and over again. Why is that important? Why is it important that we can talk to each other, say this? It's because we normalize our experience. And one of the things they really have trouble with is this sense of getting away from, I must be failing at success. The minute you start talking about this and find out other people are experiencing this in many, many different ways, the more you say, this is what the reality is. It's not the fairy tale. So one of the things I think we can do in our conversations is to start having, if you'll forgive the phrase, more grown-up conversations where we take our thinking and push it beyond where we are tending to stop. And what's your thoughts about if you get there? Telling each other stories. I tell these different stories about in different times. And one that just touched my heart was a dad saying, my family organized around my daughter is a gifted ballet dancer all of her life. It was a focus for our family. And she got into this extraordinary ballet school. And about a week later, she came to me and said, in tears, and said, Dad, I used to dance for myself. Now I have to dance for everybody else. I've lost the meaning of dance. My words.
You threw us into silence there. That's and that somewhat is about we're going down a path that we get success, but then the success is not what we really expected. I was a runner growing up, and at one point somebody suggested I could do it quite seriously, and I actually didn't enjoy running. I ran to get fit. I ran to play soccer and all those things. But the idea of just running, and the coach said, well, you're going to have to make some changes. And it's like, what? I said, well, you're going to have to stop kayaking because that's a different muscle set. And there was I'm not giving up that kind of stuff. And so these decisions and the conversations that say, hey, we go down these paths, but then we find ourselves walled in and we're not willing to have the conversation about feeling walled in, comes back to the root of our path here.
Yeah, Judy, I think I understood why the rich guy, quote unquote, what somebody so generously called the rich whiners, why they get walled in. What's your sense about a very different experience you had where you also, and people who experience loss and then the shadow is gain, how do you understand the walled inness that you felt?
Wow. Yeah, it's as if there was the particular role that had been assigned you. And if you didn't do it right and play it right, there was huge judgment about, did you care or not? And then the other piece to it that struck me, I was thinking of the conversation we three have had earlier about connection and the power of being seen, fully by another human being. And we look for that in the people closest to us. And when in these kinds of circumstances, they simply refuse to look us in the eye and see who we are, where we are now, it's incredibly isolating, it's truncating, and it's like a part of you doesn't count. That's all I can say. They'd like a certain part of you and a certain way of you being, but the rest of you, no, thank you. No, thank you. So it's the loss of being seen, I think, that hit me most hard. And then a complicated factor is often I'm in conversations with other people who have experienced a loss, and there's a tendency to think everybody's in the same place as the rest of us. And so it's to have a completely open conversation that essentially begins with the notion of, tell me how you are with this situation. And I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to hear you through this process, because it's normal and natural that we're going to be in different places with this.
So you're really framing up one of my favorite Ted Lasso quotes, which for the more educated is actually a Walt Whitman quote, I think, but be curious, not judgmental.
Yes.
Because both in what you're framing up there, or you're a non-caring widower, or you're a whiny rich person, was a judgment from somebody else. So
Yes.
is the challenge of having these conversations the fear of the judgment? And then the flip side of that is to make sure that we're all being curious and not judgmental in order to allow for and create those conversations.
Well, I think there's some fear of being judgmental, but it's also the matter that even to start this conversation, you really have to put yourself out there. And if the response is you're doing it wrong, or you couldn't possibly feel that, or if you feel that way, then you have said something quite negative about whatever else was involved. That's a lot of the heart on the line, which I think then the encouragement to the rest of us to realize how hard it is to start the conversation. People keep saying when you lose a partner or a family member, people keep saying, so how are you doing? That's what they say to you. How are you doing? And if your answer is, I'm having a really wonderful day, there's just a big problem with that.
Well, that immediately goes to the judgment then.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? So that's that switch of, I'm having a wonderful day. You shouldn't be.
Yeah,
and
exactly right. You shouldn't be.
And as opposed to, I think you raised something there, my push for people to be curious, not judgmental on the listening side, but your side was the willingness to put the heart out there a little bit and be honest. Yes. And it's the blend of those two that get us having the right conversations that take us to the right place, that the fertile ground for emergence, as Rick calls it.
Right.
David, I think what you're doing, what Judy does through her work, certainly what I've done through a part of my work and the writing, et cetera, is to make this conversation, to help create this conversation and make this phenomena, to normalize it. Judy, one of the things that Judy and I have talked about that, that is shared here that you can't, in some way you can't talk about, is the hole that it leaves. For Judy, if you talk about the hole that it leaves as all sad and whatever, that's fine. If you talk about the hole that it leaves as full of possibilities, that's not okay. If the folks I work with, or your student who graduates from college or whatever, whatever there's a hole, if we see that hole in a different light, if we see that hole as full of possibility and start changing our sense about, have a grown-up idea of gain always comes with disruption. Part of disruption is loss. The loss is where possibility lies. John O'Donohue says, spaciousness is where possibility lies. And I think there's a tendency around that spaciousness, one, not to see it, mm-hmm. Two, to want to prematurely fill it.
Right.
Because we're not used to it, it's uncomfortable. And yet the things that have emerged for people in these possibilities are extraordinary.
Which is interesting because we mentioned this before in some of our conversations about the idea of creating space.
Yeah.
And way back in a very early episode of our podcast, talking to another mutual friend of Judy and I's, Margie Hageney, she talked about the idea, the research behind, if you ask a question, you should count to 10 seconds before you say anything else, because people's thinking doesn't kick in until about second 7. And then they start to answer. And as simple as that is, as a creating space, as broad as what we're talking about here, which is create space for people to deal with both the light side and the shadow side of whatever it is that they've gone through.
Exactly.
When we first started talking about this, this is always this danger. You think you understand. Rick started laying out this notion of the whole that comes from gain, or the gifts that come from loss. My initial reaction was, I remember this because I'm a type A person. This was the deal about if you achieve something and you get it, there's going to be a letdown. That's the mindset I was coming to with this. And then sometime recently, I thought, I got it. This is not about letdown. This is about something has happened that has transformed the life you had into something else. And it's very open, or it's a deep hole. And it has huge power and potential if you can sit with it and not treat it as if it's the yellow line in the middle of a busy highway that you got to get out of it. But I think the language, Rick, that you've often used about this is the whole is the gift.
The whole is the gift.
The whole, and not in the sense of the kind of gift you can grab, but the sense that it will take a lot of conversations with yourself and with trusted friends and advisors to create in that unexpected space that you didn't ask for what is really possible in terms of emergence. That, and it takes friends going like this with you. No, slow down, step back. Don't try to do it again. There's the notion that whatever it is that caused the hole, you cannot fill by doing it again. And so there are really interesting conversations around this, because people have a tendency to say, so now what are you going to do? And the answer is, I'm going to sit with this. Thank you. You know,
if you look at the commonality across these two experiences, whether you start with gain or loss, the disruption really occurs in three fundamental areas. Structure. You can't sell a business and have it.
Yeah.
Right? You can't be married and have lost a spouse.
Exactly.
Meaning.
Yeah.
Oh my God, my whole life was devoted to, and now it's not. And identity. And I love your fight for identity, Judy. It was like, no, that is not my identity. I am not a widow. And Wes's loss of identity, he used to sit on a plane. You go, what do you do? I'm the CEO. He'd sit on a plane. I used to be a CEO. Oh, okay. That's what they have in common. And I think what Judy's saying, one of the possibilities is to see this disruption in our lives, whether it comes from loss or gain, as an invitation for, if you will, development, for refinement, for reflection, for discernment, and maybe for, in some way, renewal.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's any message that I think the two of us would get out at this, in this, is for people to see these maybe uncomfortable, and certainly learning to live with that discomfort, to see these as real opportunities for discernment, refinement, reflection, and maybe renewal.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting as you frame that, Rick. I was thinking about my work, and probably some of Judy's, and probably some of yours as well, as you work with people through leadership transitions. When they get to a place that they always aim for, that's where some of our most important coaching has kicked in. Because whether it be a sense of imposter syndrome or a sense of what now, I hadn't put those two together, but that's where having a coach that you can talk through, well, I'm here, and now I have to do it. I have to deliver. I have to work out. That space that they create in a coaching relationship is for that conversation, which can quite often be one that's awkward to have with anybody else, because after all, you've achieved what it is you wanted to achieve.
It's the same dynamic, David. Broaden out our thinking. What if organizations went through this? We IPO'd out, right? Is that loss or gain? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And where's the loss of gain? Structure, meaning, and identity. We used to be a feisty startup where everybody knew everybody and whatever. Now we're bringing in, we know the story. So I think that this dynamic we're talking about occurs at almost every level of our lives. It occurs inside of us, in our families, in our communities, in our companies. And I love what you're saying. I would agree, David, that there are companies, and I worked in one, where this notion of the imposter syndrome is rampant, and they don't have anybody to talk to about it. Yep. It's another example of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
want to change the conversation. We want to change we need to change the conversation. In your terms, we need to make this conversation normal, and we need to make this conversation easier.
Yes.
because the other thing is you're sharing that I work with a lot of smaller businesses that are growing, and there's somewhere around that 20 to 50 employees where you go from being a ma and pa, where everybody chips in and does a bit of everything, to needing some organizational structure.
Yeah.
And that tends to be a very emotional transition for people, because you're putting in corporate and a hierarchy and things like that, and people are bemoaning the loss of the old days when everybody just did what was necessary. And yet it's coming on the back of great success, which has meant that they now have 3 times as many employees.
Exactly. And I mean, even the pandemic, is it loss or gain?
Right. Well, and the other piece of this that I have to keep in mind, since I now have this new map of thinking about these kinds of circumstances, is if you know this, you're not immune from having to go through it.
Oh, beautiful, Judy.
This is a recurring cycle, not because we failed at understanding it, but because life draws us forward into a new variant of this dynamic. So for instance, my daughter Meg and her partner Kevin are expecting a baby on the 23rd of June. I will become a grandma.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you. So what is it that I'm saying goodbye to when I say hello to that? And what and what goes along with the joys of having a new baby in the family? Dirty diapers, sleeplessness, schedules that can't be controlled, people traveling all over to be able to see this new young being. I mean, all of a sudden, everything that was settled down is disrupted by the thing that you just knew was going to be terrific. Terrific plus is what it amounts to. And so that's an interesting notion. Terrific plus. And on the other side of the loss, sad and
Plus.
Yeah, yep. There's a plus there.
Yeah. David, I want to take what you're asking and respond in this way. There are many responses to what you're saying. They're great questions. One of the things that I recognized in Wes putting that ad in the Wall Street Journal is the bravery. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, yes, initially nobody knows who it is, but he found a way to have a conversation that was hard to have, and that was his way of trying to create that conversation. I think for each one of us, your question maybe slightly reframed is, what is the conversation you are really dying to have? And maybe dying because you're not having it. And how might you reach out in some way, in bravery, like he did? That's the personal challenge.
Mm-hmm. I love the way you framed it there as well, because I go back to that statement of the conversations we can't have and the power of having them. I wonder how many leaders are asking that question. What are the conversations that we're not having?
Yeah.
And let's get them out on the table and let's have them, because that's the thing that will help take us to the next level or help us manage through whatever it is that's going on. Because I imagine just about every team, there's conversations that aren't being had that should be being had.
Oh, yeah, it's the classic. We all stay in a meeting, listening to stuff. Any questions, anybody, any comments? No, then we all go to the bathroom and tell the truth. And the conversations go in there because we're not having them where we need to have them. I love what you're saying, David.
So as we kind of start to wrap up, and I'll come to you, Judy, in a second, I think that's a great lead into the potential solutions there. We've talked about being curious, not judgmental of people around us. And you're talking about being bold enough to start the conversation. And I think even being bold enough to ask what the conversations need to be is a leadership perspective. What else can we be offering out there that people can be doing to start having some of these conversations that you can't have?
I think one of the things that they can do actually tracks back to an earlier conversation we had. They can tell stories of people in these situations that have these dynamics, just as a way of helping people see the many variety of forms that this takes, so they can recognize it in themselves or around themselves. So there's some storytelling involved in this, with the map overlaid of this particular dynamic of loss and gain, so we can see it.
Yeah, David, I think what you're asking is really fabulous. And again, I think if we all take that question on, we've already begun. We've already begun to do something about it. What can we do? One of the things, and this will sound harsh, and it's something I've run into, it will change. I think we have to sit back with ourselves and say, I've got to start this conversation somewhere. Where can I start it? Doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable, but I have to start in a place that I think invites me, in a sense, to take the risk. And what we will come to know, and I think what Wes came to know, and is there are folks you can have these conversations with and folks you cannot, and it may begin to change the nature of the social environment in which you operate. Yes. Because if they cannot go along with you, and this is harsh, you might have to, in some ways, leave them behind.
Yeah, but so in some ways you're saying find the people that you can have these conversations with, because that's where the richness comes from, that fertile ground for emergence again.
Yeah.
And those who can't just disappoint us.
And unfortunately, you may have to leave them behind. It seems harsh. They won't understand. We don't even like that idea. It's the truth. And I've observed this with folks I've worked with, many of them over the years. I've had to leave a family member behind in some way. I can have these kind of conversations, these kind of interactions. By the way, I'm sure your listeners may be wondering what happened with the Wall Street Journal ad. So maybe we can make sure we get that in. 30 people answered the ad. 30. There was not one crank. He was going to do a focus group, and through me nagging him, a focus group is problem solving. A focus group is not a conversation. And I nagged him into go eat lunch with people. Go have a conversation. He picked a dozen, invited them to his house, invited me to be there, and absolute awed what I was hearing. And they met regularly for the next 2 years. I went on to spend a dozen years trying to understand what I had run into, and led to conversations I could never have imagined that enriched my life and my work and what I knew about. All because he put that ad in the Wall Street Journal.
And I'll do a quick ad for you here that What Happens When You Get What You Want is Rick's book, and available all good bookstores. Judy, closing thought?
Yeah, it seems to me that these conversations are what take the cap off the constrained energy of our individual lives and our organizational lives. What we're really talking about is a conversation that frees up energy, and it's life energy.
Cool. Well, I'm going to set a challenge this time, as opposed to it just being a passive listen to it. So what? We put this out on all the podcast links, but we also post it to Humanergy's YouTube site. And if you go to the YouTube site, you can actually comment underneath the video that you watched. And so my challenge to people listening is, what are the conversations that you're not having that potentially could be fertile grounds for emergence, to use Rick's words? What are the conversations you're having? I'd love to see if anybody wants to post up on the YouTube site, and we'll see what we've got. Maybe we can discuss that in a future episode. But in the meantime, Rick, Judy, thanks again for another deep, rich conversation, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dave.
So there you go. Hopefully an enjoyable conversation for you. And on the idea of conversations that we can't have and the power of having them. and conversations as a fertile ground for emergence and the willingness to have them. And I'm challenging people, as you heard in the podcast, to throw up some of the conversations that you wish you could have at work, that you should be having, but you're not for whatever reason, because we don't know the consequences. We are stuck on it. We've achieved something, or we've got a downside, a plus side. And I really like what Rick and Judy were talking about, the shadow of success and failure, that with failure comes successes and freedom. With successes comes some failure, a dark side to that. And like he was talking about the posted advertisement that, hey, I've got everything I want and now I don't know what to do. And as Rick pointed out, it's because we've lost structure, meaning, and or identity that then provides a whole. But look forward to exploring this more, and I look forward to seeing what you have. Please add to the YouTube site and any comments underneath. I'd love to see them. Enjoy. Thanks. That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.